New clues to sensory brain disorders. New clues to sensory brain disorders. You're listening to Technical News Reading, presented by Hakeem Alibokis Alexander on Spreaker, social podcasting, presented for World Reading Club in association with Uniquilibrium. This edition's reading focus comes to us from neurosciencenews.com and is titled New Clues to Sensory Brain Disorders. It was published on February 2nd, 2023. Summary. Researchers have identified two distinct processes that are triggered in the brain when a person is exposed to prolonged or repeated sensory input. Source: University of Queensland. How the human brain adapts to external stimulation, an important mechanism for species survival, has been made clearer by University of Queensland UQ research. Queensland Brain Institute, QBI researchers Dr. Ruben Rideau and Professor Jason Mattingly have discovered that two distinct processes are triggered in the human brain when exposed to prolonged or repeated sensory inputs. When light enters the eye, neurons in visual areas of the brain begin to fire, and scientists have long debated whether the brain adapts to this prolonged input because the neurons get fatigued, or instead fire more selectively to sharpen perception, Dr. Rideau said. Our work has shown for the first time that both processes occur, but they become active at different points in time. The research team designed an experiment to measure a phenomenon called the tilt after effect, a visual illusion in which prolonged exposure to a visual stimulus causes shifts in subsequent perceived orientations. If you stare for a few seconds at a patch of black and white stripes rotated slightly clockwise from vertical, and then look at a perfectly vertical pattern, those vertical stripes will appear to be tilted slightly counterclockwise, Dr. Rideau explained. The electrical activity of volunteers' brains was measured using electroencephalography, EEG, at the start of the experiment and again after looking at the patients. The results were compared against a sophisticated computational model of a working brain. We simulated different hypotheses for how adaptation changes brain activity and discovered that neither the fatigue nor the sharpening account alone could explain what was happening, Dr. Rideau said. Our featured image is a digital one with a silhouette of a human head with no hair, and looks like some lines and graphs, and it's ones and zeros, binary code, and some other internet connections going on back there. It's a gray field with a blue is the face. Very interesting image. Hopefully it'll be on Twitter. You can take a look at it here on Spreaker. The caption reads, "The research team designed an experiment to measure a phenomenon called the tilt after effect, a visual illusion in which prolonged exposure to a visual stimulus causes shifts in subsequent perceived orientations." Image is in the public domain. But when we combined the two, we started to see a match. We discovered visual neurons initially show fatigue during the adaptation phase, but after a few hundred milliseconds, behave in a manner that suggests they are sharpening perception. Professor Mattingly said the process could be compared to completing a jigsaw puzzle. Normally, you have some idea of what the puzzle should look like when it's finished, but while you're putting the pieces together, you must pay attention to the fine details on each piece, Professor Mattingly said. The brain combines information about what the final image might look like with the incoming sensory information conveyed by the eyes, allowing us to recognize what we're seeing. Professor Mattingly said, "The results helped explain one of the most intricate processes in the brain and provided a platform for further research into what happens when brain damage or disease causes the system to break down." Professor Mattingly said the results helped explain one of the most intricate processes in the brain and provided a platform for further research into what happens when brain damage or disease causes the system to break down. Most of us can recognize familiar objects and sounds effortlessly, but the computations the brain needs to perform are very complicated and not well understood, Professor Mattingly said. Having a better understanding of how sensory systems work in a healthy brain can tell us more about what happens when the system malfunctions, paving the way to better diagnosis and treatment of sensory impairments in the future. About this sensory processing research news. Author, Merritt Pye. Source, University of Queensland. Contact, Merritt Pye, University of Queensland. The image is in the public domain, the one I recalled and referenced earlier. The original research is under closed access from a paper that's titled "Distinct Early and Late Neural Mechanisms Regulate Feature-Specific Sensory Adaptation in the Human Visual System" by Ruben Rideau and others, PNAS. We'll be back in just a moment with an abstract from that paper. You've been listening to Technical News Reading, presented by Hakeem Ali Bokus Alexander on Spreaker, social podcasting, presented for World Reading Club in association with Uniquilibrium. This edition's reading focus comes to us from neurosciencenews.com and continues with an abstract from the paper titled "Distinct Early and Late Neural Mechanisms Regulate Feature-Specific Sensory Adaptation in the Human Visual System." A canonical feature of sensory systems is that they adapt to prolonged or repeated inputs, suggesting the brain encodes the temporal context in which stimuli are embedded. Sensory adaptation has been observed in the central nervous systems of many animal species, using techniques sensitive to a broad range of spatio-temporal scales of neural activity. Two competing models have been proposed to account for the phenomenon. One assumes that adaptation reflects reduced neuronal sensitivity to sensory inputs over time, the fatigue account. The other posits that adaptation arises due to increased neuronal selectivity, the sharpening account. To adjudicate between these accounts, we exploited the well-known tilt after effect, which reflects adaptation to orientation information in visual stimuli. We recorded whole brain activity with millisecond precision from human observers as they viewed oriented gratings before and after adaptation, and used inverted encoding modeling to characterize feature-specific neural responses. We found that both fatigue and sharpening mechanisms contribute to the tilt effect, but that they operate at different points in the sensory processing cascade to produce qualitatively distinct outcomes. Specifically, fatigue operates during the initial stages of processing, consistent with tonic inhibition of feed-forward responses, whereas sharpening occurs around 200 milliseconds later, consistent with feedback or local recurrent activity. Our findings reconcile two major accounts of sensory adaptation and reveal how this canonical process optimizes the detection of change in sensory inputs through efficient neural coding. You've been listening to Technical News Reading, presented by Hakeem Alibokis Alexander on Spreaker, social podcasting, presented for World Reading Club in association with Uniquilibrium. This edition's reading focus comes to us from neurosciencenews.com. It was published on February 2nd, 2023, that's the date of this reading, and is titled New Clues to Sensory Brain Disorders. The categories it was published under are simply neurology and neuroscience. You can read this article and others like it for yourself by visiting neurosciencenews.com. That's neurosciencenews.com. Neurosciencenews.com. New Clues to Sensory Brain Disorders.